Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. In today's video, we're going to talk about a problem that plagues sourdough bakers from time to time, and that is the problem of a weak starter. And what happens a lot of times is you'll be baking sourdough bread, your starter is working perfectly fine, and then over time you'll see that it just starts rising more slowly. It doesn't produce the same open, airy loaves that you were getting in the past, and your starter begins to weaken. This is particularly a problem for home bakers, and especially home bakers who don't bake very frequently. I've done a lot of research on this topic, and I'm going to talk about what causes that. But the main reason that your starter will become weak is that it becomes acidic. Your starter contains yeast and lactic acid bacteria, and when that lactic acid bacteria starts to outrun the yeast, it will build up a residual baseline acidity over time, and when your starter becomes acidic, it chokes off the yeast, and your yeast will not produce the same tall, airy, fast-rising loaves that you're used to. Now, a lot of people see this and they describe what they have as a weak starter, but really what it is an acidic starter. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to identify if your starter is acidic. We'll talk a little bit about the science behind it, and then I'll give you some instructions for how to fix it. So before we get started, let's just talk about what I define as a strong starter versus a weak acidic starter. These are the criteria that I use. The first one is the rising time. A strong starter with low acidity will typically rise and peak in about 4 to 6 hours after a 1-1-1 feeding at 74 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius room temperature. A weak acidic starter will take much longer than that to rise and peak. That's typically the first giveaway that your starter is weak or acidic, is that it's not rising and peaking as quickly as it has in the past. The second thing I look at is the smell. A strong starter with low acidity will smell yeasty and fresh. A weak starter with high acidity will smell like cider vinegar. That is one of the telltale signs of an acidic starter. It will smell just like vinegar. If you don't trust your nose, you can use a pH meter or a pH tester. I have a video where I review these devices. This is the Hanna Halo 2 and the Apera Zen. These are the two pH testers I recommend. If you're going to buy one of these lab quality testers. The inexpensive pH testers you'll find on the internet really don't work. But you can use a pH tester to test the acidity of your starter, and a strong starter with low acidity will typically peak at a pH of around 4.1 or 4.2. That's a relatively low acidity. A very acidic starter will peak at a pH of 3.7 to 3.8. That would be a very acidic starter. The next thing I look at is how long does your starter maintain its volume after it peaks. So a strong starter with low acidity will peak, and then it will remain at that peak for a long time before it falls. A weak acidic starter will immediately fall after it peaks, and it'll fall very quickly. Then I look at the texture of your starter. A strong starter with low acidity will be thick, fluffy, stringy, and ropey with big bubbles in it. And a weak acidic starter will typically be thin, runny, and have very small bubbles on top. You can typically pour a weak starter out of your jar. The next thing I look at is how quickly your starter can rise your dough in bulk fermentation. A strong starter with low acidity can rise your dough very quickly, and a weak acidic starter will rise your dough in bulk fermentation very slowly, and it may often stall out and stop rising before it actually hits your target percentage rise. The next thing I look at is what I call the gluten friendliness of your starter. And what I mean by this is a low acidity, strong starter will basically ferment your dough through bulk fermentation and all the way through final proofing and create a tall, airy ball of dough. A weak acidic starter will start breaking down the gluten prematurely, and you'll start to see your dough flattening, sometimes in bulk fermentation and in final proofing, because that acidity in your starter prematurely deteriorates the gluten structure and it creates those flat, early overproofing loaves. And lastly, you want to look at your loaf. A strong starter with low acidity will create an open, airy, beautiful crumb. A weak starter with high acidity will create a dense, gummy crumb. So we typically use these terms, strong starter versus weak starter, but I'm telling you a weak starter is always an acidic starter, and that's what we'll focus on in this video, how to identify an acidic starter and how to fix it. Here are the 8 criteria on one page if you'd like to pause here and review these in more detail. There's also a printable document and guide in the description of this video and on my website. So before I create each one of these videos, I always go out and do research to see what professional bakers have to say about this topic. I have a stack of sourdough baking books this tall. And you're probably asking the same question I asked when I started to research this, and that is, I've never even heard of this before. Why doesn't anybody talk about an acidic starter? You can read dozens of sourdough books. Nobody talks about your starter being acidic, and the acidity can cause all of these problems. Why is that? The reason is because a lot of the most popular sourdough baking books were written by professional bakers. Chad Robertson, Ken Forkish, Jeffrey Hamelman. These people live in a bakery, they bake every day, and they're feeding their starter multiple times per day. Their starter is in top shape because they're running a commercial operation, they're running a bakery, they're feeding it all the time. This issue of a weak acidic starter is uncommon in a production baking environment, but it's incredibly common for home bakers because home bakers don't feed their starter multiple times per day. They don't bake every day. They put their starter in the refrigerator for a week, then they take it back out. That infrequent baking schedule that a lot of home bakers follow is tailor-made for creating acidity in your starter. That's why you don't read about this in books written by professional bakers, but why it is rampant with home bakers. And before we go much further with my sweeping generalization about professional bakers, there is one exception to the rule. My friend Thomas Teffry Chambellan from France, he wrote this book, published in English in 2021, Sourdough Baking, a Treatise. Thomas is a microbiologist and an incredible sourdough baker. In his book, on page 80, he has a whole chapter called Managing the Acidity of Your Starter. This is one of the few books that dedicates significant content to that topic because if you're a sourdough baker, the one thing that you have to be most concerned about is managing the acidity of your starter and your dough. Every bad thing that happens when you're baking sourdough, other than maybe burning a loaf in the oven, think of every other thing that can go wrong with your sourdough baking. The vast majority of it is caused by acidity. Gummy crumb, slow rising, weak starter, premature overproofing, all of those things that happen are caused by the acidity in your starter. So as a sourdough baker, this has to be one of the skills that you develop, especially as a home baker where that infrequent baking and infrequent feeding of your starter is prone to creating acidity. And to really understand what's going on here, all you have to do is go back in time to the creation of packaged yeast. Once packaged yeast was created, they basically separated the yeast from the lactic acid bacteria that creates the acid in your starter. So now, all those problems I just talked about, they go away if you don't use a sourdough starter because there's no lactic acid bacteria in this packet. So this made bread making very simple, very consistent, very easy. And people started using packaged yeast because it eliminated all the problems caused by acidity. But bread made with packaged yeast, because it doesn't have lactic acid bacteria, tastes like cardboard. It just doesn't taste very good. So that's the reason people got back into sourdough baking, is for the flavor that you get from the lactic acid bacteria, which gives sourdough bread its unique sour flavor. But with that comes all the problems of managing the acidity of sourdough bread. That's why people quit using sourdough in bakeries. That's why people quit baking sourdough at home, is because it's hard. The yeast that's in here is trying to rise your loaf, and the lactic acid bacteria that's in here is trying to choke off the yeast and destroy your loaf. So it's a hobby that has certain downsides, and that's why people stop doing it. And it's also why sourdough baking is a little tricky, and it takes some technique to get it right. So the way I like to think about this is managing the acidity of your starter and managing the acidity of your dough is a skill you have to develop as a sourdough baker, and learning to de-acidify your starter is just like doing routine maintenance on your car. It's just like doing a periodic oil change. Over time, for most home bakers, your starter will drift towards being more acidic, and occasionally you have to intervene and fix that. So before we go much further, I just want to clarify that I am not a microbiologist, even though I play one on TV, and we are going to get into some pretty serious science here. So I am relying on the work of people like Thomas Teffrey Chamberlain, and another great source is the book series called Modernist Bread by Nathan Myhrvold and Francisco Magoya. That also has some great research in it around sourdough starters, sourdough acidity, and the impact of acidity on your loaves. But one of the unique things that I do have is a few years ago, I built a sourdough strength testing lab here in the basement of the Institute. And over the past couple of years, I have run hundreds of scientific experiments comparing the impact on starter strength from feeding them different types of flour, different feeding ratios, different temperature of water, and different hydration levels, to name a few. I know more about sourdough starter behaviors than I care to admit. And what I'll be showing you here today is based on the scientific theory, but also what I have observed with my own eyes. I will also be simplifying some of the science here in the interest of educational clarity. So now let's cover some basics. Where does this acid come from that causes all these problems? It's already in your starter jar. There are two basic microbes in here, yeast and lactic acid bacteria. The yeast eats flour, drinks water, and it produces carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is what creates the gas that rises your dough, and it creates your open, airy crumb in your leavened bread. That comes from the yeast. Its symbiotic partner, the lactic acid bacteria, also eats flour, drinks water, and it consumes some of the byproducts of the yeast, and it creates two types of acid, lactic acid and acetic acid. Lactic acid is the yogurty type of tangy acid that you would taste in yogurt. Acetic acid is that bright flavor of cider vinegar. For purposes of simplification, I'm generally going to refer to the acetic acid, the vinegar type of acid, just for simplicity. So these two microbes have traveled the earth together since the beginning of time, and they're locked in a symbiotic relationship in your jar. The yeast is just trying to create carbon dioxide, and the lactic acid bacteria is basically trying to kill the yeast. This is just like Romulus and Remus or Cain and Abel in a jar. Joseph Campbell could have written a chapter about sourdough starters in his famous book, because when you put these two symbiotic organisms in the same place, they get along together for a little while, but then the longer they're in there, the lactic acid bacteria will try to strangle the yeast and choke it off. So for all the discussion going forward, I'm going to talk about these 6 stages of the starter feeding cycle. So first, let's talk about what should your starter look like and smell like typically at each one of these stages. Stage 1, your starter is recently fed. This is where you've just added flour and water to your carryover starter, and it will essentially smell like flour and water. There will not be a lot of other aromas in there. As your starter begins rising, it'll rise up from your starting line. So most people will put a rubber band on their starter jar when they feed it. When it starts rising, you'll begin to smell a ripe, sweet smell. Some people say it smells like bananas, cantaloupe, green apples. You'll smell a little bit of that sugary, sweet ripeness. The third stage is when your starter peaks. So this is an important stage to be able to identify visually. After you feed your starter, it will rise, rise, rise. It'll be domed on the top. It will get to a point where it stops rising. The dome will flatten, and when that dome flattens on top, that's the peak time of your starter. That's an important time because typically you want to use it in your dough either right before or at that time that it's peaking. Now, at that time that it peaks, it'll continue to have that ripe, sweet smell, and sometimes it will also begin to smell yeasty as it's reaching that peak. The fourth stage is when your starter begins falling, so that flattened top now actually starts falling back down to the starting line, and the aroma of your starter will change here because you'll start to smell a hint of acidity, and you'll typically smell a beer and wine type of alcohol smell as your starter passes peak and begins falling. Stage 5, this is when your starter has fallen all the way back down to the starting line, but there's still bubble activity on top. So it's flat but active. And typically what it will smell like here in that fallen stage is this is when you'll first start to smell the pronounced vinegar smell from the acidity. And stage 6, when your starter is starving, this means that the population of starter has consumed all the available food. You'll see the bubble activity completely stop. Your starter is very acidic at this time, and it'll smell like acid, but it will also start to smell like alcohol, which is a byproduct of the yeast when it starts running out of food. And this alcohol smell is different than that beer and wine smell. This is more of a boozy alcohol smell, more like vodka. And then I'll just briefly mention that sometimes your starter can smell like acetone paint thinner or nail polish remover. That's a very difficult odor to diagnose. It can happen at any time in the feeding cycle. I'm not going to cover that here. I have a separate document on my website, and it's in the description of this video. You can download that and understand what to do with your starter if it smells like acetone. Here's a summary chart from that document. You can pause here if you'd like to review this in more detail. So we talked about what you can see and smell with your sourdough starter as it goes through that feeding cycle, but now let's go inside the jar and understand that interplay between the lactic acid bacteria and the yeast. So I'll use the same 6 stages of the starter feeding cycle. Number 1, when your starter is recently fed, it's important to note when you feed your starter, we take a small portion of carryover starter from the previous day and we add fresh flour and fresh water. By doing that feeding, it dilutes the acidity. So that's the point in time where the acidity is the lowest possible point, right when you fed your starter. And the thing that loves low acidity is the yeast. So when we're in that recently fed stage, the lactic acid bacteria automatically starts generating acid. It's the only thing it knows how to do. But the yeast is in its happy place because the acidity is low. So the yeast starts reproducing and making new yeast cells, and it starts generating carbon dioxide in that low acidity environment. In stage 2, where your starter is now rising above that recently fed line, the lactic acid bacteria is still happy, it's still pumping out acidity, but it's still fairly low acidity, and the yeast is still very happy, and it's still reproducing more baby yeast cells and generating carbon dioxide. At stage 3, your starter has risen and peaked. The lactic acid bacteria is still happy. It's always happy. It just keeps producing acid, and now the acidity level is moderately high because it keeps building up cumulatively. But the yeast is at its highest carbon dioxide production now because it's at its largest yeast population, and the acidity level is still not high enough to be choking off the yeast's carbon dioxide production. But then, stage 4, we cross a threshold. The starter begins falling. After it peaks, it starts falling. What happens here? The lactic acid bacteria is still happy. It's still pumping out acid, but now the acidity level is high. The acidity level is too high for the yeast to be producing at optimal capacity. So the CO2 production, the carbon dioxide that rises the dough, starts dropping off very quickly because the yeast is choking on vinegar. Stage 5, the starter has now fallen back almost to the starting line. There's still some small bubble activity on top, but the lactic acid bacteria has now produced a very high concentration of acidity in the starter. The yeast is totally choked off, and there's really no meaningful carbon dioxide production happening at this point. And now when the starter is starving, there are no bubbles, it's flat, it's covered with hooch on top, it smells like alcohol and acid. This is where you've reached the extreme acidity level for the lactic acid bacteria production, and virtually no carbon dioxide production coming from the yeast. So you can see here on that top line, The lactic acid bacteria is always happy. It's always producing acid. It never stops. The yeast, on the other hand, is happiest in that low acidity environment before the starter peaks. That is when the yeast is at its optimal reproductive rate and its CO2 production rate. Now, there are two common misconceptions about what happens when your starter peaks and it begins falling. If you asked 100 people, why does your starter begin falling after peak? 99 or maybe 100 of them will say, it's because your starter is running out of food. It's completely wrong. Your starter has plenty of food. What's happening is the acidity level rose to a certain point where it chokes off the yeast. The yeast stops producing carbon dioxide, so it can't hold that height of the starter up anymore. The carbon dioxide starts leaking out through the top of the starter, and the starter begins falling. The second thing that happens at the same time is as the acidity level increases in your starter, it stimulates something called the protease enzyme. The protease enzyme lives in your starter, and that's like little Pac-Men that eat the gluten strands, and they love acidity. They get stimulated when the starter becomes acidic, so they start munching through the gluten, and that's what causes your starter to fall after peak as well, and why it will become totally flat and pourable, almost like the thickness of paint, is because all that gluten has been chewed up by that enzyme. The second misconception people have is when your starter peaks, they also think that the yeast starts to die off. The yeast doesn't die off. Even though it stops producing carbon dioxide, it just goes dormant. So the number of yeast cells really plateau when it reaches that peak and starts falling. The yeast population is still the same. They just can't produce carbon dioxide. They go to sleep and they remain in a dormant state until the next feeding, when you dilute that acidity down with fresh water and fresh flour, and that wakes up those dormant yeast cells and they start reproducing again. So I'm going to do a little demonstration now to show you what happens during that starter feeding cycle and that interplay between the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria. But before that, you're probably saying, what the heck is Tom doing wearing an apron? Because I never wore an apron before in one of these videos, but I'm also wearing a fancy shirt, and this demonstration might get a little messy. So I dug this apron out. This is from when I used to work at the laboratory at NASA. Actually, I never worked at the laboratory at NASA. I bought this in the gift shop, but I kind of wanted to work there, and I think back now that maybe if I had made some different life choices, things would have worked out differently for me. But that's neither here nor there. Let's proceed with the demonstration. Okay, what I'm going to show you here is an example of a very unique barnyard that's inhabited by yeast and lactic acid bacteria. The yeast will be played in this production by these little cows. These cows eat flour and water, which is grass and water in the barnyard, and they belch out carbon dioxide. The lactic acid bacteria are played by this little velociraptor and his friends. This is an acid-spitting dinosaur. They also eat the grass and drink the water, and they actually eat some of the excrement of the cow. That's a little gross. So they're not only an acid-spitting dinosaur, they're a cow-eating acid-spitting dinosaur. These are the lactic acid bacteria in this demonstration. So what we have here for the demonstration, we have this tray. This is the starter jar. We have the green felt, which is the grass that's also known as the flour. We have the little trough here, which is the water that you're going to feed your starter. At the beginning of the process, we have the cow, that's the yeast, and we have the dinosaurs that are lactic acid bacteria, and the acid-spitting dinosaurs are going to spit 100% cider vinegar. So let's see what happens when we feed our starter. So stage one, we take a portion of yesterday's starter, we feed it flour and water. There is a population of yeast and lactic acid bacteria in that carryover starter that you use. The lactic acid bacteria will always outnumber the yeast, usually by 100 to 1 times. But in this example, just to keep the math simple, we're going to start this off with 2 yeast cells, which are 2 cows, and 4 lactic acid bacteria cells, represented by these little miniature acid-spitting dinosaurs. Now, as soon as we feed this, the yeast start pumping out carbon dioxide, the lactic acid bacteria start pumping out acid. And just to keep the math straight, we're going to assume that each one of these little acid-spitting dinosaurs spits out 5 milliliters of acid at each one of those 6 cycles in the starter feeding cycle. So we have 4 dinosaurs times 5 milliliters. I have 20 milliliters of acid here. Now what happens is they're going to spit this out into the grass and into the water and onto the cows. And when the cows eat the acid, they become incapacitated and they can't create carbon dioxide anymore. So in this first stage, we don't have that much acid here. So I'm just going to spread this out around each one of these 4 dinosaurs. Oh, I hit one of the cows with it. So we have 20 milliliters of acid, but you can see the cows still have clean water. They still have a lot of grass. Let's move on to stage 2, rising. Stage 2, our starter is rising. This is that zone that's the yeast's happy place. So these cows are happy. They're not only pumping out carbon dioxide, they're pumping out baby cows, also known as calves. So they actually create 6 baby cows in that process. So now we have 8 total cows in here pumping out carbon dioxide. And the lactic acid bacteria, like I showed in that chart, they're happy all the time. So at every one of these 6 stages, they just double their population at every cycle. So our 4 acid-spitting dinosaurs become 8. But now, as we go through this cycle, 8 acid-spitting dinosaurs each spit 5 milliliters of vinegar into the barnyard, so that's 40 milliliters. Here's 40 milliliters of vinegar, so I'm going to add a little bit to each one of our acid-spitting dinosaurs here. And you can see now it's getting in front of the cows. There's a little bit going in the water. So there's still some patches of grass here that haven't been contaminated with the acid yet, but you can see the cows are losing a little bit of their eating space. Stage 3, now the starter is peaking. The cows are pumping out carbon dioxide, but they're starting to eat some of the acid because it's in the grass and it's in the water. So now they only produce 4 baby calves. So I had 8 cows, and now my reproduction rate is slowing because that acidity is growing. So I have 4 baby calves still pumping out carbon dioxide. My 8 acid-spitting dinosaurs always double at each cycle. They create 8 more, so now we're up to 16. 16 acid-spitting dinosaurs create 5 milliliters of acid each, so that's 80 milliliters of acid now getting piled on here. Now look what happens. Now, almost all the grass is contaminated. There's acid in the water. So all these cows are really struggling to find a patch of grass that's not contaminated with the acid. Stage 4, we're past peak and we're falling. And if you remember from the previous charts, this is where that cutoff point is, where the yeast is now past its optimal CO2 production. A lot of these cows are eating acid now. When they eat acid, that's a contraceptive. So they stopped producing. There are no new baby cows after the peak. And 6 of these cows ate so much acid that now they're incapacitated. So I'm going to tip 6 of these cows over. So 6 cows are down because we passed the tipping point. That's a little joke for the Wisconsinites. And we have 16 acid-spitting dinosaurs in here. They double each cycle, so 16 new ones get added. So you can see once that starter is past peak, the lactic acid bacteria really start overrunning the yeast. Now we have 32 acid-spitting dinosaurs spitting 5 milliliters of acid each. That's 160 milliliters of acid added to our starter jar. You can see there's almost no dry grass here left. There's nothing left for the cows to eat. Everything's been saturated with acid at this point. Stage 5, it's a bad scene. These cows are swimming in acid. 3 more cows are down, totally incapacitated, not creating any carbon dioxide. There's only 3 viable cows left in here. They can't reproduce anymore because they're swimming in acid, but our lactic acid bacteria always double, no matter what. 32 turn into 64. Here they come. 64 acid-spitting dinosaurs create 320 milliliters of acid. This is what your starter looks like when it's in that fallen stage. When it's back down to the starting line, it's swimming in acid. But we're not done yet. One more step. Step 6, this is when your starter is starving. It's covered with hooch. It's swimming in acid. All the cows are down, totally incapacitated. No carbon dioxide production happening here at all. 64 acid-spitting seeds of Satan turn into 128. Here they come. Pterodactyls coming in hot. 128 acid-spitting dinosaurs create 640 milliliters of acid. This is a barnyard tragedy. Here's what we just observed in the demonstration, illustrated in 4 simple charts. First, the cow population representing the yeast grew very rapidly until the starter peaked and the acidity reached a tipping point. That caused the population to plateau, and then as the cows ingested the acid, they became incapacitated and stopped producing carbon dioxide. The dinosaur population representing the lactic acid bacteria grew unabated, doubling at each of the 6 stages. This caused the cumulative acid production to grow exponentially, which then caused the carbon dioxide production to peak as the starter was peaking and then rapidly fall in the last 3 stages as the acidity grew, resulting in no carbon dioxide being produced in stage 6. So after all the charts and the demonstration, have we answered the question, what causes an acidic starter? We have, and it's simple. You basically don't want to wait too late in the starter feeding cycle to discard and refeed, because you carry over a massive amount of acidity into the next day's starter. So the worst time to discard and feed is when your starter is starving. So for example, if you were doing a 1-1-1 feeding ratio, where you discard 2/3 of your previous starter and you carry over 1/3, that's just like taking a 1/3 slice of the barnyard. So at that stage 6 starving, you would be carrying over 4 unhealthy cows, 42 dinosaurs, and 420 milliliters of acid. Contrast that with the best time to feed your starter, which is when it is at peak. 1/3 slice of the barnyard at peak has 4 healthy cows, only 5 dinosaurs, and a massively smaller amount of carryover acid. Then you might ask the question, if it's better to feed earlier, why don't we feed before peak? And that's because until the starter peaks, it hasn't regrown the yeast population from the previous discard. So you never want to discard and refeed before it peaks, because then you're shrinking your yeast population. And then you may also ask, what if I can't catch my starter at peak? There is obviously an acceptable range between your starter's peak and when it's starving, but just be aware that your starter becomes more acidic the further down that curve that you wait to discard and feed your starter. In part 1, we learned how to identify the symptoms of a weak acidic starter, and we understand now what happens in that typical feeding cycle of your starter with the interplay between the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria that can cause your starter to become acidic. Now we'll apply that knowledge to figure out how do we remediate a weak acidic starter, and there are basically 2 methods. Number 1, the high feeding ratio method, and number 2, the peak-to-peak feeding method. So the easiest way to fix an acidic starter is just to give your starter a high feeding ratio. And sometimes you can fix it in 1 feeding. So let's talk about feeding ratios, and I'll explain how this works. So your starter feeding ratio, the most common one that people use for daily maintenance, is a 1-1-1 feeding. That's 3 numbers, and it's the ratio of carryover starter, flour, and water. So let's say you keep 150 grams of starter. That means you would carry over 50 grams of starter, you would feed it 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of water. That's an equal parts ratio, 1-1-1. When you use that 1-1-1 ratio, that's the lowest possible feeding ratio you'd ever want to use, because you're carrying over a fair amount of the acidity from the previous day's starter. So if you think back to our example where our fallen, starving starter was loaded with acidity, if we're carrying over 1/3 of what's in our jar, and then we add equal parts flour and water, we're not significantly diluting that massive amount of acidity that came over in a 1-1-1 feeding. So that's actually what can build up that residual acidity over time, is using a low feeding ratio like 1-1-1. So then people say, well, what if I went up to 1-2-2? A 1-2-2 feeding ratio would be 2 times flour and 2 times water compared to the carryover amount. So in this example, that would be 30 grams of starter that we would carry over, and we would feed it 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water. A 1-2-2 feeding ratio is not materially different than 1-1-1. So what I recommend to really knock down the acidity is you have to use something like a 1-5-5 feeding ratio or a 1-10-10 feeding ratio. So just to do the math here, for 150 grams of starter, and I'll round the numbers here slightly, if you wanted to do a 1-5-5 feeding ratio to knock down the acidity, you would carry over 15 grams of your existing starter, and we're going to feed that 5 times as much flour, that'd be 75 grams of flour, and 5 times as much water, 75 grams of water. That will significantly knock down that carryover acidity that's coming from the previous day's starter. If we went up to 1-10-10, I'm rounding these numbers slightly, that would mean we would only keep 7 grams of starter out of this jar. That's a tiny drop of starter in the bottom, and we would feed that 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water. That massively knocks the acidity down by using a tiny, tiny amount of your carryover starter from the previous day. Sometimes you can remediate this problem with one big feeding like that, because you're flushing out all of that acidity that carried over from the previous day's starter by just using a very small amount of it to feed your new starter. So the way this works, and it's pretty obvious, is through dilution. We're diluting that massive amount of acidity in the starter jar with the next feeding. So if you assume this jar of water colored with blue food coloring represents a very acidic starter, if we did a 1-1-1 feeding, and I'll just approximate these for an example, and I feed this equal parts flour and water, you can see with a 1-1-1 feeding, I've slightly diluted that down, but it's not really significantly different. Now compare that to if I did a 1-10-10 feeding, where I take a tiny amount of the previous day's starter and I feed that 10 times flour and 10 times water. Now you can see that dilution effect very clearly right there by using a 1-10-10 feeding. And that's only if you do it one time. Now imagine if I take this 1-10-10 and I do another 1-10-10 with this. I feed it 10 times water, 10 times flour. Now look at the dilution effect from that original starter just with 2 of those 1-10-10 feedings in a row. So you can see the massive impact that you have in diluting the acidity by doing the high feeding ratios. That's a great method. But there are 2 important caveats with this high feeding ratio. One is you can't feed the starter too late, and the second is you can't feed the starter too early. So let's talk about what that means. If I do a 1-10-10 feeding ratio and then I just let this sit until it rises, falls, and is completely starving, it will turn itself back into the starter that it originated from. Because the yeast population and the lactic acid bacteria population, that ratio of those cells, is what was carried over into this starter. We diluted it, which gives the yeast a runway to reactivate the yeast, so the yeast does get a little bit of a head start, but you still have a lot of lactic acid bacteria cells in this jar. And if you give them enough time and let that starter completely fall flat again, it will get very close back to where it started. So when you do a high feeding ratio, you don't want to feed it too late, meaning you don't want to let it get back to that completely fallen or starving level. You want to catch it sometime before that. And then the second rule is you don't want to feed it too early. This is critically important. And a lot of people make this mistake, is they say, Tom said do a 1-10-10 feeding ratio, so you do 1-10-10 ratio, but your starter will take a really long time to peak with 1-10-10 because we use just a tiny drop of starter in here. So then people get impatient and they wait and their starter's not rising. And then they say, but Tom said if I do 2 1-10-10s back to back, that'll really strengthen it. And then they discard it before it peaks. You do another 1-10-10 feeding, and you know where I'm going with this. You're massively weakening your starter because you never let the yeast population grow back to where it was before you discarded. So if we do a 1-10-10 feeding, that tiny drop of yeast or of starter that we put in this jar, it has to multiply its population by 20 times just to get back to where it was before you discarded and fed. So if you discard and feed again before it peaks, you're massively weakening that population. So always, always allow your starter to peak before you feed it. Never discard and feed your starter before it peaks because that actually weakens it. So I've described this technique in some of my other videos, and for some reason, people still get confused by this. So let me just be clear. A high feeding ratio does not weaken your starter unless you discard before it peaks. I can't be more clear about that. And people will watch this video and somebody will say, I'm doing a high feeding ratio, and people will say, oh, no. Tom from the Sourdough Journey says if you do a high feeding ratio, that weakens your starter. It doesn't. It only weakens your starter if you discard before it peaks. Once it gets to peak and past, it strengthens your starter. So that's why these two rules apply. Never discard a high feeding ratio before it peaks, and always discard and refeed before it falls completely flat. So you have that pretty big window to refeed after it peaks and before it falls flat. So the second method for deacidifying a weak starter is to use the peak-to-peak method. Now this is basically doing short interval feedings over a short period of time where you discard and refeed your starter as soon as it peaks, hence the name. So now let me explain the details of the peak-to-peak method. Let's assume that I have 150 grams of a very acidic, weak starter here. Now the way I'm going to do this is, instead of using the high feeding ratio method that I talked about earlier, I'm going to do a fairly low feeding ratio of 1-2-2. So that's 2 times flour, 2 times water compared to the carryover amount. But I'm going to do these over a very short feeding interval. And I'm going to watch my starter very closely. And as soon as my starter peaks, I discard and feed again. So this is more of a time-based method because I'm trying to compress this process into 2 days so I can do it over a weekend, for example. So here's what I would do. Let's say at 8 o'clock in the morning, I take my very acidic starter, 150 grams total. I'm going to discard 80%. So I'm going to keep 30 grams of my starter, and I'm going to feed that 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour. That's my 1-2-2 ratio. And then I sit this starter in a place where I can see it, and I watch it and watch it and watch it, and I wait for it to peak. So as soon as that dome stops rising, it domes on top, and then the dome flattens out, that's the peak. At that time, I immediately discard and refeed the same feeding ratio again. So let's say I did that at 8 o'clock in the morning, and let's say it takes 8 hours to peak, because that's a characteristic of a weak starter, is that it's not peaking in 4 hours after feeding. It's taking a long time. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my starter peaks 8 hours after feeding. I immediately discard and feed again, 1-2-2, and I watch it again. And now 10 o'clock, 6 hours later, it peaks. Something very important is happening here. The first peak-to-peak method, it peaked in 8 hours. On the second feeding, it peaked in 6 hours. That's what I want to see. You want to see a shortening time to peak. So this is working, but now I have a problem because it's 10 o'clock at night. And if I do 1-2-2 feeding at 10 o'clock, I have to get up around 2 o'clock in the morning to check my starter to see if it's peaking and feed it again. And I don't want to do that. So what do you do with the peak to peak method when you run into that problem? The easy thing is put it in the refrigerator, come back the next morning, and pick it up again. That's the simplest way to do it. Another option is that you can do a very high feeding ratio at 10 o'clock at night. Let's say I do 1-10-10 feeding, and that'll just stretch out the time so that it's not going to peak until morning. But that's a little risky because I don't know when a 1-10-10 ratio will peak with this starter. So the third option is I put my starter on ice. So at 10 o'clock at night, I know if I feed this 1-2-2, it'll peak in the middle of the night. So I feed it 1-2-2, but I put it in a bowl of ice at 10 o'clock. It will take about 4 hours for this ice to melt, and the starter won't do anything until the starter melts and the starter temperature comes back up to room temperature. So it's just like feeding it 4 hours later. It's just like feeding this at 2 o'clock in the morning. And if I use more ice, it's like feeding it at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. The general rule that I use is I use 2 times the amount of ice in weight compared to the starter to delay it about 4 hours. And there's no exact science here because it depends on your room temperature. But just to give you a ballpark, if I have 150 grams of starter, I'm going to put 300 grams of ice in this bowl, and that'll delay the start time by about 4 hours. It's just like I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning to feed this. So that gets me through the night. I do my third feeding by catching it at peak the next morning. And if that peaked, let's say in 5 hours, and I fed it at 7 o'clock, so now my cycle is it peaked in 8 hours after the first feeding, 6 hours after the second feeding, 5 hours after the third feeding, I do the peak to peak feeding again. On the fourth feeding, it peaks in 4 hours. That's not uncommon to really get this back in top shape in 3 to 4 feedings, or I could do 1 or 2 more peak to peak feedings. But once you get to that 4 hour rise, that's pretty much where you want it to be. Now, I love this method, and I recommend that everybody learn this peak to peak method because you can use it all the time. If you keep your starter in the refrigerator, let's say for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks because you don't bake, and then you take it out of the refrigerator, your starter will be acidic and it will be sluggish. Do 1, 2, 3 of those peak to peak feedings, it'll immediately bounce back. If you leave your starter out during the summer and it gets very hot in your kitchen, becomes very acidic, very weak, do 1 or 2 of those peak to peak feedings, it'll bounce back really quickly. So this is a real common technique that I use just to jumpstart my starter occasionally. And then periodically, like doing the oil change maintenance on your car, if your starter is just drifting slowly and slowly towards that weakened state, let's say once a month, once every 2 months, once every 3 months, you take it for a spa day and you do the peak to peak feeding, give it a little TLC, and it'll bounce back to full strength. I use it all the time. So now let's talk about the science behind the peak-to-peak feeding method. And the reason I want to show this in detail is because when I do this, I use a pH meter. And I test the pH of my starter when I feed it and when it peaks. And I can tell by that pattern between the changing pH levels that the starter is definitely deacidifying. But I don't want you to have to go out and spend the money on one of these devices. So I'm going to show you the detail of this experiment so you can observe what I'm doing. And then you'll be able to tell just from the way your starter behaves, you can approximate what's happening with the acidity without needing to buy a meter. Now, to understand the science behind this, we need to talk a little bit about the pH scale. The pH scale is a way to measure the acidity. And the thing that's a little confusing about it is it's an inverse scale. So if your starter has a high degree of acidity, it will have a low pH. And if it has low acidity, which is favorable, it will have a high pH. So we basically want a starter with a high pH, not a low pH. A good way to illustrate this is by looking at the acidity of vinegar versus water. Pure cider vinegar has a pH of 3.0. That's very acidic. Water has no acidity. This has a pH of 7.0. So these are our two bookends. A very acidic starter will have a pH of about 3.7. It'll be down here in the neighborhood of vinegar. You don't want your starter sitting down here. When you initially feed your starter and you dilute down the acidity, it will have a pH of about 5.5, which moves it up into this range. So now I'm going to go through this example and show how with each one of these short interval feedings using the peak-to-peak method, you're going to see how this pH of the starter moves farther away from vinegar, which is what we want, and closer to water. So in this example, we start with a starter that has a pH of 3.7. It's very close to vinegar. Now you would know this without having a pH meter because it has all the telltale signs we talked about in the first part of the video. It smells like vinegar. It's flat. It takes a long time to peak. It takes a long time to rise the dough, and it creates a dense gummy crumb. It's unmistakable that this is a weak acidic starter sitting down here close to vinegar. So now we start the peak-to-peak method. So we discard 80%, we do a 1-2-2 feeding, and our diluted fed starter now has a pH of 5.0. Then the lactic acid bacteria starts producing acid. The starter now peaks at 3.8, so it's getting better. It went from a 3.7 to 3.8, but it took 13 hours to peak. So that's a telltale sign of a weak acidic starter. We're looking for it to peak in about 4 hours. It's taking 13 hours. So as soon as it peaks, discard 80%, feed 1-2-2 again. Now my diluted starter goes up to 5.1. The lactic acid bacteria starts producing acid. The yeast starts rising the starter towards peak. Now it peaks at 3.9. So again, we're moving in the right direction. And most importantly, it peaks in 6 hours. So you can tell you're deacidifying and strengthening your starter because we just cut our time to peak from 13 hours to 6 hours. And the way that happens, which we know from the first part of the video, is because by diluting that acidity down, it favors the yeast. The yeast produces more yeast cells. The yeast produces more carbon dioxide. You can see evidence of that just with these two cycles where it went from a 13-hour peak to 6 hours to peak. Now we discard and feed again the third time. Now my diluted starter recently fed is at 5.2, again moving slightly to the right. It starts peaking as the lactic acid bacteria is producing acid. Now we peak at 4.0 and we do it in 4 hours. So we went from a 13 hours to peak, 6 hours to peak, 4 hours to peak, and now we're at a pH of 4.0, which is much better than 3.7. But the number I typically look for the ideal pH at peak is about 4.1. So I'm going to do one more cycle here. We discard 80%. Our diluted starter after it's fed is now at 5.4. So again, it's climbing each time we feed it, which proves that our acidity is going down. And it peaks in 4 hours again. And now I'm at my target of a 4.1 pH, which is where I want to be. So our time to peak went from 13 hours to 6 hours to 4 hours to 4 hours. You could do this one more time. And when it generally plateaus at that 4 hours to peak, 3 times in a row, you know that your starter is at a good acidity level like 4.1. And you don't have to guess. You can look at the criteria that we talked about at the beginning of the video. It doesn't smell acidic. It smells yeasty. It's frothy. It has huge bubbles in it. It's stringy. It smells sweet. It will look and smell completely different than it did when we first started the first feeding. So that's an illustrative example of how it works. I'm going to put this chart up on the screen. You can see all the numbers here if you want to review this in detail. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is the impact temperature has on your starter and its acidity. So there are a couple simple rules around this. The lactic acid bacteria loves warm temperature. The warmer, the better. If you heat up your starter, the lactic acid bacteria just pumps out acid like crazy. And it has another partner in the jar, which I talked about briefly, the protease enzyme. The protease enzyme is like the pet of the lactic acid bacteria. And when it starts pumping out acid and the temperature gets warm, it releases its little Tasmanian devil pet that starts buzzing around through the starter and cutting through all the gluten strands and eating all the gluten. It's really a mess. Once that protease enzyme gets released, that's what causes overproofing in your dough. The thing that releases it, a lot of acid and warm temperatures. So if you're ever trying to warm up your starter to speed it up, never let your starter sit above 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius for a long time, because it will become massively acidic. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the refrigerator. When you put your starter in the refrigerator, that's a great way to just put your starter to sleep, but it doesn't go entirely to sleep. When you put your starter in the refrigerator, I tend to think of it as if 1 week in the refrigerator is the equivalent of 1 day at room temperature. So if you leave your starter in the refrigerator for a week, it will go through that rising and falling cycle and it will become acidic. But the problem is you don't see that happen in the refrigerator. Because the refrigerator temperature is cool, it compresses the carbon dioxide gases in the starter, so you don't actually see it rising and falling, even though it's essentially rising and falling, but the temperature is shrinking the gases, like when you put a balloon outside in the winter, or if you put a balloon in the refrigerator, it'll shrink the gases. So you don't see it rise and fall. And some people think, oh, my starter is perfectly fine. I put it in there on Sunday and I took it out the next Saturday. It looks exactly the same. It will become acidic in the refrigerator. So always be aware of that the refrigerator slows things down, but it doesn't stop it. So now we talked about the ways to remediate a weak acidic starter, which is through a high feeding ratio or the peak-to-peak method. But then people say, do I have to do that all the time? Like, do I have to do the peak-to-peak method? Do I have to feed my starter 4 times a day to keep it in top shape? This is the most complicated and confusing part of maintaining a sourdough starter if you don't bake every day. And I talked about this earlier. Commercial bakeries don't worry about weak or acidic starters because they have somebody feeding their starters constantly. If you're baking once a week or once every 2 weeks or intermittently, maintaining your starter can be complicated. So there are a few things that I'll recommend. One is if you're baking once a week or less, I recommend keeping your starter in the refrigerator. So there are many, many different refrigerator maintenance methods. I'll do a separate video on that. There's almost an uncountable number of them. But the basic idea is if you're baking once a week, let's say on Saturday, I keep my starter in the refrigerator and then I'll take it out of the refrigerator on Friday and I'll do a couple of those peak-to-peak feedings on Friday and it'll come back to full strength by Friday night. Then on Friday night, I'll build 11, and 11 is just a high feeding ratio that I'm going to use in my batch of dough the next morning. So let's say I need 200 grams of starter for my dough. I'll take 20 grams from my main starter. I'll put that in a jar with 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water. I'll make 220 grams of starter to be used the next day for my dough. And then I put the remaining starter in my refrigerator for a week, and I just leave it there. So this is where I leave it in the refrigerator and then I take it out about 1 day before I need it and I give it a few of those refresh feedings. That works perfectly fine. If you bake less frequently, let's say you bake once a month, you feed your starter, you put it in the refrigerator and you come back in a month, it will be more acidic and it will take a few more feedings to get it back in shape. So I might take it out of the refrigerator 2 days before I need it, or worst case, 3 days before I need it, and you just give it a couple of feedings and it'll bounce back. Your starter will come out of the refrigerator fairly strong. You'll be surprised. The refrigerator is your friend when you're trying to control your starter and to minimize the amount of maintenance that you're doing. So in closing, if you're a sourdough baker, you need to develop the skills to manage acidity. The acidity in your dough starts with the acidity in your starter. The acidity in your starter is something you can manage, and you need to learn how to do that. That's your job as a sourdough baker, in my opinion, is really managing acidity. The starter makes the bread, the bulk fermentation makes the bread. Sometimes we just need to stay out of the way. But if you let your starter become too acidic, that's when all the bad stuff happens in your bread and things start to go south in a hurry. So thanks for sticking with me on this long video, and good luck on your sourdough journey.